CJ Tremblay, and I'm the Vice President of CANI, the Climate Action Network for International Educators. And I'm also the founder and managing director of Alethea Global Consulting Cooperative, which is an organization focusing on sustainability and international education. Now, I've had the privilege of meeting many wonderful people in our sector, attending conferences as an English language testing service provider. And I've loved grabbing a quick coffee with friends, new and old, kind of like this, while we talk about the things that matter to us in our work, in our communities, and around the world. But it's my work with CANI and Alethea Global Cooperative that bring me here today, deep into my climate journey, to talk about the connection between climate change, environmental justice, and international education, a sector we all love and are deeply passionate about, and that, as much as we like to compartmentalize, is connected to the climate crisis. Now, if we haven't had the chance to meet at an event of any kind or on Zoom somewhere, I can 100% assure you I either had a coffee in my hand or we met at the coffee bar. And that's where you'd likely find me in person and where we might start to chat and have a conversation that goes a little bit like this. Did you enjoy the summer? I did, but oh my gosh, it was so hot. Yeah, too hot, honestly. It's only going to get worse. I know. Those aren't the same conversations we were having. But listen, we're in international education. We have friends and colleagues in Europe and China that face devastating flooding this summer. We've got colleagues in India and Australia who are feeling effects of more extreme weather events, our friends in the US as well. The weather can be a bit of a downer now, and those conversations can leave us feeling despondent because we know we have to take action on climate, and fast. What so many international education practitioners are grappling with is the conflict between the fact that we want to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and take actions that will continue to make our planet habitable. But we're paralyzed because it's not entirely clear to us how the climate crisis is connected to our work. Now, there are some people who've made that connection, and that's great, but sometimes we're paralyzed by not knowing what to do next. And that's totally understandable. Climate anxiety is real among international students, but it's also very real among practitioners. So it's with that context that I want to take a minute to remind you of something, that this sector has a tremendous amount of power to lead and do better. You're educating future generations, you're shaping minds, employing thousands of people, growing local economies, and that's super significant. And as you know, with great power comes great responsibility. And we can all do better and be bold and ambitious when we're armed with the right information. So here's a quick summary of the key points that I want to dig into in the next little bit. 1, there is a correlation between increased emissions and wealth, and we're going to situate ourselves in that global context. 2, the impact of climate change is not equally distributed. It's disproportionately burdening the Black community, Indigenous communities, communities of color, and poor communities and countries. And these communities are also the same ones that face systemic barriers to the opportunity of international education. Now, that's a double whammy of environmental justice and inequity. And lastly, international education is an emissions producer, and we're just starting to understand the climate impact of our operations. And what's notable is not only that we are facing a code red for humanity on this planet, our students know it, and they are begging for the adults in the room, that's us. We're the people in power. We've got the power of the sector and the power of the purse strings to step up and take action on their behalf. They took to the streets for this so that we could hear them. Now, I do want to acknowledge that this is a lot. This is the part of the conversation where people usually tell me they want to do better because they love this work, but they want to understand more. So while I could quite literally talk about this for hours and have in the past, I want to cover the basics in connecting our work to the intersection of climate action and environmental justice. So let's dig in those 3 points a little bit further and get you armed with the important information. So we know that there's a climate crisis, right? That emissions are the problem, that there's lots of sources of emissions. Thank you, science. Now, something that's less talked about is the connection between emissions and wealth. And a recent Oxfam report stated that the world's richest 1% emitted twice as many emissions as the bottom 50% of the world's population. That's bonkers. The top 1% emitted 14% of all global emissions, and the bottom 50% emitted 7% of all emissions. Now, if we unpack that, transportation is a major global source of emissions. And that same Oxfam report shared that the wealthiest 10% are emitting 42% of total emissions related to transportation. Now, there are a lot of types of transportation, but if you zoom in and isolate aviation emissions, well, the richest 10% emit 75% of all emissions connected to air transportation. So that's kind of where you start to see the connection to our work. But what is the richest 10% anyway? For us to situate ourselves in it, to be in the top 10%, you're looking at the equivalent net worth of a little over $110,000 Canadian. And to be in the top 10% of salaries globally, you're looking at around $25,000 a year. So how is that all connected to the work we do? Well, between both those measures, that likely includes all of us and probably a large percentage of our students. We are in the global top 10% wealthiest of the world, and we are emitting more than our fair share. And this is something that we don't super want to talk about, particularly when it comes to transportation and aviation emissions, because in international operations, before the pandemic, we did a lot of flying as practitioners, and many people are keen to get back to that. And our business model also depends on flying students around the world. So there's that intersection between our sector and climate change. Now, our intersection with environmental justice is also quite direct. The burden of climate change will be borne primarily by BIPOC communities, residents of countries with more political instability, food security issues, lower-lying coastlines, so sub-Saharan Africa, island nations in Southeast Asia, some parts of India, just to name a few. And they're typically not the rich destination countries, and they're barely the major source countries. The most vulnerable populations are the countries that face systemic barriers to education and certainly aren't able to capitalize on the opportunity provided by international education. And that leads us to the crux of what we're starting to understand: the size of the impact of international education on our climate. Now, there was a groundbreaking study from Professor Robin Shields at Bristol University in the UK that estimated the total emissions for degree-seeking international students in 2019 were in the range of 14 to 35 million tons of CO2. 14 to 35 megatons, what does that even mean? But that's equivalent to the emissions of a small to medium-sized country like Jamaica on the low end or Croatia on the high end, their total annual emissions. And that was incredible information because we just not really had data points like that before. And we still don't know the full scope of the emissions impact. It's really just the tip of the iceberg that we're discovering. What does that look like for travel in the K-12 sector, the language sector, the study abroad sector, short-term or long-term? And on the practitioner side, what about partnership development, meetings and signings, faculty exchanges, recruitment efforts, professional development travel like conferences? And so it's this information that brings us to the intersection of our work in international education, which is deeply meaningful and transformational, with the climate crisis and environmental justice issues. So I want to leave you with this. This might have all felt dark, but you're not alone in this. There is a lot of great work already being done. And CANI exists to support practitioners to learn about taking bold climate action and creating a network through the CANI Canada chapter to foster relationships with people who want to do better. There are also organizations that are working to support schools through that transformation. And for those of you who are working within a justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion framework, which we all are, please be sure to advocate for climate action as a dimension to your plan, because it is incumbent upon us to take action in order to minimize our carbon footprint and thus the unjust distribution of the harm from those operations, while continuing to increase access to international education. These are not easy problems to solve, and we're starting to have the conversations, and that's great. And I hope that they'll continue, and I hope that we'll continue to take action. But for now, I want to thank you for spending this time together, and I look forward to talking further. And should you need any support with that, you can find me on LinkedIn, and I'd be happy to chat more, but you might need a bit of a bigger coffee. Thanks so much. Have a nice day.